Hey guys, this is your review for your aeromedical factors and airspace test. So I'll start with aeromedical factors. So the first thing you're going to have to do is write in the 4 types of hypoxia. So hypoxic, hypemic, histotoxic, and stagnant. The next thing that you're going to have to do is answer some questions about those types of hypoxia, multiple choice. So like understand what hypoxic hypoxia is. Understand if you have alcohol or drugs in your system, what type of hypoxia you would experience. Understand some symptoms of hypoxia. You will also have to list 3 symptoms, so write in 3 symptoms of hypoxia. So memorize some good ones. Then I move to carbon monoxide poisoning. I ask you what type of hypoxia it is, so it is hypemic hypoxia. Then I ask you a couple questions about carbon monoxide itself, so for example, would you be able to smell it? Which no, because it's colorless, odorless, tasteless. Then I ask you if once a person breathes in carbon monoxide poisoning, can they just open the windows and breathe clean air and recover? And the answer is no. The effects stay in your system for 48 hours. Then I move on to hyperventilation, and remember, where hypoxia is not enough oxygen, hyperventilation is not enough carbon dioxide. So remember what hyperventilation is, and then how to resolve it. So you need to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in order to stop hyperventilating. That's why we tell people to breathe into a bag. You will then have to list 3 symptoms of hyperventilation. Then I move on to motion sickness. I ask what somebody should do if a passenger is motion sick. So some of the things that were listed in the PowerPoint were open air vents, loose and tight clothing, look outside at a fixed point. So just understand some of those things. Then you will be required to write in 3 symptoms of motion sickness. Then I move on to dehydration. And I just ask one simple question about that. So just understand that dehydration, some symptoms would be dry skin, dizzy, confused, thirsty. The next question, I move on to sinus pain, ear pain, and tooth pain. So I ask you about Boyle's law, because that's the law that governs gases and pressure. So look at that PowerPoint slide and memorize what Boyle's law is. Then I ask you some scenarios. So if a passenger is experiencing pain in their cheeks and above their eyebrow, what is it? Well, that's sinus block. If you're experiencing pain in a tooth, it would be tooth block. The next set of questions are the more difficult ones that people have a tendency to miss. I ask you about the vestibular illusions. You went over these in instrument ground school as well. So I review some of these. So understand Coriolis illusion, somatographic illusion, inversion illusion, elevator illusion. If you know those 4, you will be able to answer the questions. There are 3 questions on that. Then I move on to, I ask one question about scuba diving. So I will give you a cruising altitude. I'll say you're cruising at this altitude. How long are you required to wait? And I'll let you know if it's a controlled descent or if it's not a controlled descent. And then you have to figure out if it's 12 or 24 hours. The next question that I ask is about vertigo, sensory illusion, and spatial disorientation. Basically the differences between those 3. So there's a slide in the PowerPoint that kind of outlines what it is. I specifically ask about vertigo, so understand what that is. And then the next question I ask, which a lot of people get wrong, I pointed this one out in class, is which sensory system provides your brain with the most information regarding equilibrium? And the answer is vision. And then of course you have your skeletal muscular system and your vestibular system, which both can give you erroneous information, but your vision is your primary sensory organ. Then we go ahead and move on to some of the visual illusions. Since we do rely on our vision so much, we have to make sure that we understand what some of the illusions are. So I ask you about autokinesis. I ask you about runway width illusions. So for example, if your destination airport is wider than the runway that somebody usually lands at, what type of approach will they tend to fly, a high or low approach? Well, if the destination airport's wider, you're going to try to make it look skinnier, so you would fly a higher approach.
You have a second on
Then we get into airspace, and we reviewed this in class, so I'll go through this maybe a little more quickly, but still give you a review. So the first 4 questions about airspace have to do with how they're charted. So I ask you about Delta, Bravo, class Echo to the surface, and Tersa, so how those are charted. Then I ask you about class Bravo airspace, and for that I ask, what do you have to hear in order to enter a Bravo? I ask about the speed limits. So if you're inside a Bravo at 5,000 feet, how fast can you go? If you're inside a Bravo at 11,000 feet, how fast can you go? And then I do ask you about VFR cloud clearance in class Bravo. So that's clear of clouds. I also ask you about that in class Charlie. So that is 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. Then I ask you a generic question about when is the speed limit 250 knots, so below 10,000 feet. Then I ask you a question about class Charlie airspace's speed limit, so know that that is 200 knots within 4 miles and at or below 2,500 AGL. And then I move right along to class A airspace, understand what certificate a pilot would have to have in order to fly into it. I ask you how it's charted, which it's not charted. And I ask you what altitudes that it goes from and to, and that is a write-in. Then I move on to Charlie. I ask what equipment is required for the aircraft in Charlie. And then I move on to Echo. And the 2 Echo questions people tend to get wrong. So I ask you, what altitude does Echo start unless otherwise charted? And the answer is 14,500. What altitude does class Echo start on Federal Airways? And the answer is 1,200. So you can see, like, I'm not trying to make you learn every single detail here, but the important ones, the ones that I want you to know, I want you to study. So I'm giving you the tools to study. Then we move on to Mode C transponders. Where are those required? So in and above Charlie, within the Mode C veil, and above 10,000 feet. Then I ask some generic questions about special use airspace. So, for example, a prohibited area is established for reasons of national security, or an alert area is for high density of pilot training, or warning areas are hazardous to non-participating aircraft and they're usually offshore, or a TFR is issued for the president, natural disasters, sightseeing, things like that. Then I ask you one quick question about a military operations area. I ask you if they're exempt from the speed limit, because that's important information to know that they are indeed exempt from the speed limit. I ask you a question about TERSAs, and remember I highlighted in class today that a TERSA is a mandatory Delta with a voluntary Charlie. Then I ask a couple questions about how restricted areas, military operations areas, and controlled firing areas are charted. So know the colors and how they're charted. I do ask a specific question about restricted areas, what types of activities are in them. artillery firing, aerial gunnery, guided missiles. I also ask about restricted areas. The 3 scenarios we discussed in class. So, number 1, the restricted area is active. No one can go into it. Number 2, it's in a time of use, but it's not active. You need a clearance to fly through it. Number 3, it is not in a time of use, it's not active. You can fly through it like it's not there. I ask a similar question about military operations areas, asking if you need a clearance to fly through it, which you do not, but it certainly is recommended that you contact the controlling agency and figure out where the activity is. I ask a question about military training routes. So understand if it is a 4-digit training route, versus a 3-digit training route if it's above or below 1500. And remember, like 3/4, like a fraction, 3 over 4. So 3 is higher than 1500 AGL and 4 is lower than 1500 AGL. Then I ask about VFR flyways, corridors, and transition routes. So remember that a VFR flyway takes you around or under class Bravo. A corridor is like a hole through the Bravo. You do not need a clearance on either of those. And a transition route, you actually do go into the Bravo, and therefore you do need a clearance. And then the last question is, air defense identification zones. How far in advance do U.S. registered aircraft or foreign registered aircraft have to file their flight plans, and what kind of flight plan? So a defense VFR flight plan. So this test will be on Tuesday. Just let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you then. Have a delightful weekend.